it is the biggest elephant in the room. What do you make of this tit-for-tat trade tensions between the two sides?
Well, we believe that trade is very important for growth and for stability. We have seen in the last 70 years how much trade has helped the whole world, and it's always a bilateral issues. And I think at the end, people see that there are many ways to get to win-win situation. So we're confident that this will prevail.
So negotiations will prevail in the end?
I think there's so much scope because trade is something that usually expands your frontiers. So that's the natural way where things should gravitate.
Trade aside, one of the biggest issues being discussed here is infrastructure financing, and there's been a lack of it. In Southeast Asia alone, about $180 billion are needed every single year, but there's been a lack of it. And some view that it is the risk factor that is standing in the way, and MDBs like the World Bank need to have a higher tolerance for risk. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, it is true that many investors don't have much capacity to absorb risk. Say some pension funds, they are ready to give long-term funds, but they cannot tolerate too much risk. So you have to bring capital, especially at the beginning, during the construction phase. After infrastructure is complete, the risk usually drops dramatically. We have done a study of more than 6,000 loans with Moody's, and that becomes very clear. Also because the recovery rate, even if there is a problem, is relatively high because you have a real asset that has demand for it. Now, we at the MDBs, we are ready to provide some cushion. So instead of, for instance, lending to a project, we can provide guarantees so that the project can attract, say, some of these long-term patients, but not very risk-tolerant capital. That's a role that you're developing and can work very well.
You talked about tapping the capital market. Currently, we have about $200 trillion invested in the capital market. How do you get some of that into infrastructure financing?
Well, it's a combination of these people also understanding better, and this is why I mentioned this study we have done that show that overall, say along the life of a project or of a bond, the risk of a bond backed by some infrastructure assets typically is much lower than the risk of a corporate bond that is started. They started equal, but the corporate bond continued to have a certain level of risk, while in infrastructure this risk declines as the asset, say, consolidates. So by making these things more understandable by investors, by providing when it's necessary some cushion, and also for countries bringing together a really solid pipeline, I think that these are some key elements to really bring a very substantial amount of money from institutional investors.
How confident are you that the financing gap can be narrowed, and how quickly can that be done for Southeast Asia?
Well, I think that there is also a consideration of how to mobilize the domestic savings, because this is a region that has relatively high saving rates. So you have to see how individuals can also find a way, say through pension funds or investment funds when they exist, to be, say, either shareholders or to invest in infrastructure. So I think the combination of having these instruments and to have some common regulatory framework that people can look and understand easily and be confident, and you could see very sharp increases in coming years. Already we see increases in the order of 30–40% a year, and could be even higher.
Joaquim, Levy, just a quick question on how do you stop leakage of financing? Because people have been bitten before. How do you stop some of all this going into graft and corruption and making it really, really, I suppose, focus on what you're trying to do with infrastructure?
Well, I think that the governance is a very key role in really developing the capital markets, and people have to trust in the investment they're making. And so I think this discussion on how to attract private investment also create the right incentive to improve the governance in this sector. And this is not unique to the region, but certainly could make a big difference. And we have always scope to address problems in the individual areas.
But one of the ways, obviously, is public-private partnerships. Do you think they work?
Oh yes, if you take some things in consideration, if you focus in sectors where the capacity of the cost recovery is stronger, and if you have the adequate, say, regulatory framework, there are many cases where you really get a lot of better outcomes because you don't have cost slippages, because you have more efficiency, and you also often get new technologies in infrastructure. So yeah, PPP can have a very important role in many segments of infrastructure.
How would you view the success, or thereabouts though it is, in its nascency at the moment, of One Bridge, One Road from China?
I think it's a very important initiative. I think connectivity is important. We partner in a number of initiatives. I think MDBs in general, including AIIB, the new development bank for the region. And I think that, again, trade can bring a lot of benefits across the world. So we have individual countries have to understand what's better for them and really focus and sometimes see how this fits their say, financial capacity. But there is so much potential there.
You touched on AIIB, the new kid on the block, the new bank out there. How do you think AIIB has done?
Well, I think that we have partnered in a number of let's say, projects, in part because they're new, so they have been willing to co-finance projects with us, and they have been very much committed to keep very high standards in their operations. So it's a great addition because there is so much demand, as you mentioned in the beginning.
Now, Joaquim, you were also the finance minister of Brazil before. What do you make of the aggressive easing cycle that's happening in the country?
In Brazil?
Yes.
I think it reflects also the sharp decline of inflation. 2 years ago, there was a major, say, realignment of prices, and you freed a number of markets. That meant that after an initial period of adjustment, we had all the conditions of having a decline in price. In addition to good crops and also economic activity that has created certain slack in some markets. So I think it really reflects very positively the current conditions of the economy, and we hope that there will be room to continue to be at low levels.
The central bank sees inflation at 3.8%. The target is 4.5%. What do you make of the two?
Well, we have margins, so they are very well within.
With the rate of inflation right now?
Oh, absolutely. And actually, I mean, if you can stabilize around this rate, you'll be very good. You reduce the overall risk of the economy.
The biggest risk to Brazil right now would be?
Well, I think that it's the continuation of the reforms. They are very important so that you free the economy and create an environment that is conducive to get investment rates back to the level that were a couple of years, 3 or 4 years ago. And with this, really restart growth in a solid basis.
Brazil has always been susceptible to the volatility in the markets. Given what is happening in the markets right now, how do you think Brazil would be able to cope with the current situation?
Well, Brazil has more than $350 billion in reserves and the quite strong banking sector. So I think that it's in a good condition to really show that it's resilient at this time.
Now, we have breaking news right now, a headline crossing that the Brazil Supreme Court rejects Lula plea, paving way for prison. Is there any initial reaction from you?
Well, I'm just seeing the Supreme Court working, and they have looked at their interpretation of the law, and this is an important issue. So I think that what is important that you have a very clear due process, and this is really done in a very transparent way.
Do you see that contributing or boosting the investor sentiment in the country?
Certainly, when you have institutions that work well, that's exactly the way to get more investment.
So what are the prospects for the country going forward then in the next 2 to 3 years? How do you envision the economy to be?
Well, I think that the stronger the institutions, the normal thing is to get back to probably in the short term growth of 3 or 4% as you close the slack, and then you try to converge to a potential growth of 3%.